He is not on. He's not on my Facebook page. Welcome, everyone. For those who are confused by this, I and Tess were in a competition for who would get the most donations for the Center for Bioethics and Humanities over the course of December. And I obviously won, which is why I have the privilege of dressing like Tess today and doing one of her job responsibilities, which is to introduce the speaker at today's Arts and Medicine series. So I will do that, and then I will sit quietly and take my punishment. Dr. Marjorie Levine-Clark is Professor of History and Associate Dean of Diversity, Outreach, and Initiatives in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of Colorado, Denver. She has published widely on gender, health, welfare, and poverty, including 2 books, her first, Unemployment, Welfare, and Masculine Citizenship. I feel so weird talking about this right now. So Much Honest Poverty in Britain, 1370 to 1930, I can barely read, which came out in 2015 with Palgrave Macmillan in their Gender and Sexuality in History series, and also Beyond the Reproductive Body, The Politics of Women's Health and Work in Early Victorian England, which came out with Ohio University Press in 2004. She's co-director of the Health Humanities Minor, and she is hoping to lead a course in London this summer on plague and cholera. Can I come? That sounds like so much fun. Plague and cholera this summer in London. Her presentation today is from a new book project tentatively titled Unemployment, Health, and the Body, From the New Poor Law to Thatcher. Welcome, Dr. Levine-Clark.
I was waiting. Is the mic on? Yes, it is. Okay. So I've been told I'm wearing an outfit that is very bad for being set up to give talks. So hopefully my mic is set up on my my necklace, and I don't have a place to put the other part for the mic. So I want to get back to the beginning. There we go. This is actually an image from one of the texts that I'll be talking from. Different disciplines kind of give talks in different ways. Historians are bound to scripts. We're one of the fields that kind of use texts to read from, and so you'll see me referring and reading from a text, but I will be looking up at most of you, probably not you in the corner there, but I will try to see most of you during this talk. And thank you very much for coming, and to Tess and others for setting this up. So my field is Britain, my geographical field. So the research and the presentation will be based on research in Britain. So George Newman was the chief medical officer to the Ministry of Health of the British government. In 1934, he wrote with reference to unemployment, "The effect of resultant idleness on a manual worker may unfit him to resume his former occupation owing to lack of practice or loss of muscle tone. The effect of prolonged worry and anxiety may impair normal bodily functions such as digestion or aggravate existing states of mental irritability or instability, and thus engender various forms of psychoneurosis, and thus or the result may be actual excessive sickness or incapacity." Newman constructed unemployment as an experience that affected body and mind, challenging aspects of masculinity that were core to working class men's identity. In particular, the inability to control the body, loss of strength, chronic disability, and anxiety challenged the image of the hard man associated with manual labor. Work, able-bodiedness, and the ability to provide intersected so tightly that to disrupt one category meant to disrupt them all. A non-working man was less than able, he was disabled or diseased, and he was feminized. incapable of working or providing for a family. The medical officer Newman, in his government position, tended to downplay or actually misrepresent the connections between unemployment and ill health, given the litany of possible problems that he outlined and that his regional medical officers reported. This was in a context when medical professionals, particularly through the British Medical Journal, were beginning to interrogate deeply the connections between unemployment and things like malnutrition, critiquing the amounts the government was providing through unemployment benefits. Medical researchers, general practitioners, specialists, and the unemployed men themselves recognized the problems that unemployment posed for men's health, their bodies and minds, and in turn, their identities as working class men. This material is part of a larger project on unemployment, health, and the body that I've just begun working on. I've been thinking about unemployment as an experientially and representationally embodied phenomenon, meaning it's something that people experience through their bodies and something that is represented by the body. As the sociologist Carol Wolkowitz urges, we need to remember that although everyone has a body, not everyone has the same relationship to its economic and symbolic significance. Capitalism values working and consuming bodies. People out of work are usually neither. They are absent from producing value or consuming value in a capitalist system. They become bodies in need, reliant on the state or charity to survive. Their bodies take on very different symbolic significance from the bodies of those at work. This is even more the case for bodies outside the norm of health. Feminist philosophers have been especially useful to me in initially thinking through some of these issues. Maura Gatens, for example, writes, "To claim a history for the body involves taking seriously the ways in which diet, environment, and the typical activities of the body may vary historically and create its capacities, its desires, and its actual material form." And this is something I'm going to come back to. So thinking about that the ways that our bodies act, our bodies behave, our bodies are, create our capacities, the body's desires, and our body's actual material forms. Gatens presents the examples that the body of a woman confined to the role of wife, mother, domestic worker is invested with particular desires, capacities, and forms that have little in common with the body of a female Olympic athlete. Similarly, we can think of the ways that the body of a person used to getting up at 5 a.m. every day to work in a factory for 10 hours has different capacities, desires, and material form than someone who stays out of work or unable to work. As an unemployed skilled engineer summed it up in 1934, "Physically, I'm not the man I was." To begin to address these issues, I'm going to concentrate on working class men's unemployment and what being unemployed meant for men's sense of their bodies and health. I'll focus on two periods of unemployment crisis, the 1920s and 30s and the 1970s and 80s. I'll first examine some men's applications for unemployment benefits in the 1920s and the ways that ideas about the body shaped benefit decisions. Next, I will look at unemployed men's first-person narratives to explore the ways they drew connections among health, employment, and masculinity. Finally, I will examine the ways medical professionals discussed these same connections. All three sets of sources demonstrate the fundamental challenge unemployment posed to men's embodied identities. 3 million applicants for national unemployment benefits were denied assistance in Britain between 1921 and 1930 because they were found to be not genuinely seeking work. In order to receive benefits, and there were other reasons why people were denied benefits, but this was one of the big categories, and this is the category I'm going to focus on here. In order to receive benefits, unemployed workers were supposed to be able to prove that they were genuinely seeking work, this is a quote, but unable to obtain suitable employment. To apply for benefits, a worker registered as unemployed at his or her local employment exchange. Contested cases went to local insurance officers and courts of referees. Appeals of their decisions went to the umpire, a Crown-appointed officer. And in this section, I'm going to draw upon the umpire's decision books and case files of applicants from the National Archives for the 1920s, where findings were based on these not genuinely seeking work decisions. The records suggest that having skill implied a body suited to particular forms of labor. Skill was something that was embodied and demonstrated a seriousness about employment that gave advantage to skilled applicants in benefit decisions. This could justify a skilled claimant's refusal of jobs that did not measure up to his qualifications or that he insisted could damage existing embodied skill. So for example, when you applied for benefits, the umpire would ask you, you know, have you applied for this job or that job? And a skilled applicant could say, well, you know, that job was not suited to me because I'm a skilled miner in this position. So you'll hear some of this. A 1923 Ministry of Labor memorandum to local employment committees explicitly differentiated between skilled and unskilled applicants for benefit. A stricter test is, as a rule, applicable to the case of the unskilled worker than to the case of the skilled worker. The umpire tended to privilege skilled men in appeals for benefit. For example, in a March 1924 decision, the umpire approved the appeal of an unemployed marine fitter, commenting that, "I see no reason why unskilled work as a laborer should be regarded as suitable employment for him." Going back to Gatens, we can imagine that the umpire took seriously the ways that the typical activities of this man's bodies created its capacities for particular types of work. As a means to take control of definitions of suitable employment, applicants tried to emphasize the specialized nature of their skills. The more embodied a man's skills, the more boundaries he could place around a genuine search for work and construct an occupational identity. In a case in April 1925 involving 9 Yorkshire miners, the issue at stake was the type of coal the men were accustomed to working. The men emphasized that not all mining was the same, and suitable work for them meant working in a particular type of coal seam, which required particular types of physical challenges. Alan Booth, for example, claimed, "I have never had any experience in a seam of coal as thin as what he wants to send me into. I have only been used to the Halifax hardbed coal and fire clay, of which the coal is 28 to 30 inches thick." This is very specific. J. Holloway, speaking for the rest of the miners, said that it was not fair to say that because men were miners, they were fit to work in any part of the country or in any kind of mine. Different pits have different methods, and the work in question was work to which they were not used. These men insisted on the embodied nature of mining, the environmental specificity and special skills required of different types of mines. Forcing them to take on unsuitable work would deprive them of their embodied skills and identities as specific types of miners. Developing skill was a way of training the body and mind to behave in certain familiar patterns. These types of arguments came up in cases involving sailors who saw work on shore as unsuitable. In 1925, the boatswain Archibald Ross of Inverness appealed to the Court of Referees' disallowance of his benefit. He stressed his identity as a sailor, claiming to have been genuinely seeking the employment to which I am suited. The work offered by the Employment Exchange in Inverness to me is quite unsuitable. His body was suited to the sea, not to the shore. The umpire agreed. Another seaman, John McLean, appealed, "I'm doubtful as to my success in laboring ashore, as I've never tried it before, as all my time I have been employed at sea." The 24-year-old from Glasgow refused the employment offered to him, stating, "It was not suitable employment. The employment that I am genuinely suited to is employment at my own trade. I do not consider it right for me to accept an offer of working or laboring, as I have never been at such work and have no experience at same." In this instance, the umpire did not find in favor of the claimant. In all these cases, though, the applicants very distinctly tried to shape what constituted suitable employment in order to strengthen their claims that they were genuinely seeking work. They used the concept of suitability to emphasize their body's particular capabilities as well as their occupational identities. Sometimes the cases are very direct regarding the health of an applicant's body. For Angus MacLeod, a seaman from the Western Islands of Scotland, the Court of Referees denied his benefit in 1929 because he refused to look for work on the mainland. The chairman of the Court of Referees noted, "He has youth on his side, and the probability is that he has a good physique, and that notwithstanding the present glut on the labor market, he could secure employment in an industrial area where less favorably equipped persons cannot find employment." This is all on assumption, right? The probability is that he has a good physique because he's young. This explicit reference to the applicant's body suggests that officials of the unemployment benefit bureaucracy certainly took the body's capacities and forms into account when measuring an applicant's genuine search for work. Finally, one of my favorite cases, Maurice Joyce, who came before the umpire in 1925 to appeal the decision to deny his unemployment benefit on the grounds that he was not genuinely seeking work. Joyce, described as an old man, was a union cooper. The Court of Referees had refused his benefit because they thought he should have been looking for a different occupation, since he was no longer physically able to handle the tasks of a cooper, in their opinion. Joyce was appealing the decision that he was too weak or old to perform his usual duties. He stressed, "I'm quite fit to carry on with my usual occupation as a cooper," insisting that it was not his physical ability, but the lack of available positions that prevented him from obtaining employment. The umpire, however, upheld denial of benefit, finding that Joyce's chance of obtaining work as a cooper is remote, while there are a number of younger men unemployed. The work calls for a good deal of physical exertion, and younger men are given the preference. The umpire disallowed Joyce's benefit, deciding that Joyce was capable of work and should try to get some work suitable for a man of his age. This example clearly positions Joyce's lack of work as related to a body that was no longer able to compete with younger men in his occupation. Yet the umpire considered him able-bodied relative to other less strenuous work. As men aged, however, they embodied unemployment differently than younger men, as their options for work and welfare were constrained by assumptions about their physical abilities. I'm now going to move on to the first-person narratives of unemployed men, which even more explicitly connect health issues to unemployment. I'm going to focus on narratives that overtly raise issues about men's identities, but there's a huge amount of material simply about the illnesses men and their doctors attributed to unemployment. According to the 1974 National Survey of the Unemployed, for example, the unemployed are less fit and in a poorer state of health than the working population generally. The survey further described that about 1 in 6 of the unemployed aged 45 or under reported some limiting disablement or chronic sickness, compared with about 1 in 11 of the general working population. And very nearly half of the unemployed over 45 reported such handicaps, compared with 18% of the working population over 45. More recent studies have affirmed these connections between unemployment and poor health, as well as higher mortality rates. And I should say the whole category of unemployment is really recent. It was constructed in the 1880s. There was no such thing as unemployment as a structural category before the 1880s. People didn't really kind of think about the connections between unemployment and health until really the 1930s. That group of doctors I was talking about earlier were saying, well, unemployment really causes malnutrition. There's a causal connection here, pay attention. 1930s, and then it's really not until the 1970s where there's a lot of study, a lot of connection being made between unemployment and ill health in a really big way. So these issues are incredibly recent in thinking about these kinds of structural connections between unemployment and health. It's a very modern history. And the history of kind of what unemployment does to the body is still, you know, it's still present in terms of how it's being studied. In general, while by the 1970s, surveys like this would have included women. You know, women as unemployed, you know, unemployment as a problem for women is even more recent. You know, so it's really been a problem for men. Surveys like this would have included women. Concerns about unemployment and health predominantly still focused on men, and the unemployed as a generic category usually referred to men. Because work was not considered a core part of women's identities in the same way it was for men, the lack of work was not assumed to affect women as workers in the same ways. As wives, unemployment affected women in very interesting ways. That's a whole different paper, unemployed men's wives. First-person narratives make very clear that unemployed men internalize the connections between able-bodiedness, employment, and working-class masculine identity. The narratives that I draw on here come mostly from collections edited by social scientists and others who wanted to publicize the plight of the unemployed. I have a water here. Unemployment, according to the men's voices in these collections, made them sick, made them appear sick to others, and changed the ways they related to the world. A riveter from Greenwich commented to the social scientist E. White Bakke in 1931 that it takes it out of you when you've been working all your life, and it puts years on you. It's put years on my head this last 11 months has. Us men that's learned to work is lost without it. This man defined himself and others like him through work. Rather than manual labor causing physical and mental problems, he conceptualized that his 11 months of unemployment had aged his body tremendously. Anthony Martin, a seaman whose story was recounted in Time to Spare in 1934, lamented, "You feel like you've got some disease and people were fighting shy of you." For Martin, unemployment marked him as an outsider, like a leper to be avoided by general society. John Bentley became unemployed in Lancashire and walked to London to try to find a job. He couldn't recognize the man he'd become, verminous and starving, sleeping out on the embankment, quite incapable of doing a day's work, even if I had it. These men emphasized their weakness and their alienation from themselves when out of work. They inhabited their bodies differently as unemployed rather than working men. Many of the narratives talked about the importance of keeping busy so as not to become depressed or anxious. A typical comment comes from Keith Birch, a dock worker from Hull, whose narrative was included in Stories from the Dole Queue, published in 1972. You have to really try hard to stop yourself going downhill. You have to go to libraries, you have to go for walks in the parks, you have to do the garden, decorating, even when you can't afford to decorate, because I know the end result. With thinking quite a lot about it and having the time, the end result would be a mental breakdown. Men's anxieties about unemployment led them to seek out domestic tasks to keep busy. Indeed, their wives complained about them having them around the house too much. Birch's entire narrative here revolved around the domestic. His solutions to the lack of grounding he felt from unemployment were these domestic tasks. Even though these type of tasks had been incorporated into masculine selves in the 20th century to a certain extent, the issue of having to do tasks like gardening and decorating in place of paid work rather than as hobbies challenged a man's purpose. Many unemployed men thought that work itself would be the cure to the illness-producing experiences of unemployment. A millwright, whose story was published in the 1934 Memoirs of the Unemployed, revealed, "If I were in work, I should be able to work off odd aches and pains. But now if I wake up with a headache, it stays with me for 2 days. The mere fact of being at work again would make a new man of me." Here was an explicit connection between being at work and being a man, being a new man. The ailing, feminized man created by unemployment would disappear with a job. Similarly, a wire worker commented in his memoir that he experienced deafness when he was at home. "But I can hear quite well in a noisy street or workshop. No doubt I should improve considerably if I were back at work." And this again has to do with these stories of wives, which are really, really interesting. And wives have tremendous anxiety, and they go to the doctors and get Valium to deal with their unemployed husbands. So, I mean, it's a really interesting cycle. For this man, home was associated with having a disability, while the public sphere of street and workshop brought him back to himself in a certain way. Men who were unemployed for long periods of time also reflected that their bodies were no longer able to perform productive work. One man wrote in Time to Spare of getting a position at a foundry, but on the second day I collapsed at work and had to be taken home. It was pretty heavy work, and I wasn't strong enough for the job. From lack of food, I hadn't got the stamina to stand up to it. Unemployment, and particularly the inability to afford nutritious food, emasculated this laborer, who returned to a job weak from being unemployed, which resulted in his collapse. Lack of strength also worried Anthony Martin, who had worked at sea. He contemplated, but then sometimes we can't manage that bit of work when we do get it. We find we've rusted like a steam engine that has been idle for some time. It deteriorates. We haven't got the strength to start a job, even if we had one. A skilled letterpress printer contributed to the Memoirs of the Unemployed, noting he had been ill, but because of unemployment, he was unable to follow the doctor's orders as to food, etc., with the result that I have slowly sunk into a severe form of nerves, which has become so acute that if a situation was offered me now in my own trade, I would not mentally and physically be able to do it. These admissions of weakness, collapse, and deterioration, often suggesting feminization of body and roles, would have been very difficult for these men, but they also spoke to the dangers of unemployment on a broader basis. Physical weakness came often from insufficient food, which could be blamed on the government's stingy unemployment benefits, which then could lead to a politicization of unemployment. There wasn't a lot of politicization, actually, of unemployment in Britain. Medical practitioners, though, did politicize unemployment. They agreed that unemployment had a negative impact on men's bodies and minds. They started to take up the question of unemployment in the 1920s and 30s, writing about the eugenic impact of unemployed bodies on the future of the nation, and specifically the malnutrition associated with unemployment. For example, a group of medical professionals wrote to the British Medical Journal in 1934, worried that the new Unemployment Act did not provide sufficiently for the maintenance of an unemployed man and his family. Our experience as physiologists and members of the medical profession leads us to believe that there will be grave danger of widespread physical deterioration if large numbers of unemployed people had to rely solely on the state. They contended that the determination of needs of unemployed workers can only properly be arrived at in consultation with medical and other expert opinion. This group of doctors saw unemployment as a medical problem. They medicalized it, right? They're taking a social problem and creating a medical problem from it, and tried to assert their expertise to manage unemployed bodies. If in the 30s, doctors were trying to establish their credentials in overseeing unemployment as a public health problem, by the 70s and 80s, they were all too familiar with firsthand experiences of unemployed men as patients. I want to focus this section on a series of articles published in the British Medical Journal in 1981 called Unemployment in My Practice. Now, for a historian, finding a series of articles called Unemployment in My Practice, you know, when you're working on something like this, it's really nice. So these essays, written by general practitioners from throughout the British Isles, were supposed to address the ways that doctors' practices had changed as a result of unemployment in their regions. Not surprisingly, GPs commented that unemployment had increased demand on their services and had created physical suffering and anxiety. Additionally, GPs were used to men asking for medical certifications to get out of work, right? There were, you know, men who came to them to say, you know, will you sign this to say that I'm sick so I don't have to go to work? These demands decreased as unemployment increased because men were afraid of losing their jobs. You know, if they were saying they were sick. So more and more men were working through their illnesses because they were afraid of losing their jobs. Men with pre-existing conditions tried to hide them in order to keep and obtain employment. The general practitioners drew on many of the same themes as unemployed men in making connections among unemployment, health, and masculine identity. They worried about men whose poor health prevented them from finding work and resuming normal lives. For example, Dr. Albert Jacob, writing about his practice in Dundee in Scotland, discussed the case of Mr. M, a bus driver who got injured in an accident. Chronic back pain kept him from his regular job, and he couldn't find another one. Dr. Jacob commented that the situation was a non-starter for a man in his mid-50s with no skills other than his ability to drive a bus. In any case, no employer is likely to look favorably on a recruit with a physical difficulty if he can get a fit man to do the job. And with unemployment, there are plenty of fit men looking for work. Both age and infirmity told against Mr. M, whose body essentially became marked as unfit for work. Dr. Jacob concluded that too many middle-aged men are being thrown on the junk heap. In a similar case, Dr. Jeffrey Smurden of Liskeard in southeast Cornwall wrote of Bill R., who had worked as a slaughterer. His hands, however, became chronically infected, and he had to give up his position, never finding another one. Dr. Smurden wrote, he is 30 now, with a family. Feels he is on the scrap heap, same language, and is worried about the future for his children. The divisional medical officer has accepted that he is unfit for work, but the problem is really that there is no work for someone with his restricted abilities. Summarizing the feelings of many of these GPs, Dr. John Mackay of Glasgow wrote, as a family doctor in these circumstances, I feel frustrated because I find it difficult to restore a man's self-respect when he is obviously devalued in his own eyes and in the view of his family. Men expected to work to provide for a wife and children, and unemployment was a constant reminder of their inability to do so. Health issues, in addition to being out of work, exacerbated men's sense of failure. Some GPs worried particularly about anxiety and mental illness suffered by unemployed men. John Wilson of Whitehead in Northern Ireland wrote about the ways unemployment created illnesses for men that might have been psychosomatic, since they were cured by returning to work. For example, a young man presented with chest pain on the afternoon he got his redundancy letter. 1 month later, he was successful in getting an interview for a new occupation, and his pain cleared and has not recurred. Wilson also mentioned that healthy middle-aged men arrive with complaints with minimal pathology, but insist on full checkups because they now have more time, with the result that the fears of serious illness are greater. So men were just like fixated on their bodies in ways that they hadn't been before. In general, the doctors talked about increased levels of anxiety. Dr. C.P. Tanner of South Shields believed that unemployment is increasingly the precipitating factor in all stress conditions. He had experience with young men who had never been employed. And this was a huge problem, you know, of young men who had left school and there are no jobs, right? So they immediately go on to benefit. So young men who had never been employed, who seemed to attend his surgery because they had nothing else to do, and were reflecting on their lack of purpose. Meanwhile, the middle-aged man, a good worker, responsible citizen, and devoted father, indulges in a brief moment of tearful anguish that is indistinguishable from that seen in bereavement. He is redundant. Trying to negotiate ill health, anxious minds, and the inability to provide forced unemployed men to reconstruct their embodied identities. Unemployment was for them in many ways a disease that, as the philosopher Gatens put it, changed the body's capacities, its desires, and its actual material form. One of the things you might have noted in this paper is that I didn't really emphasize the spiral of becoming ill or injured, losing a job, having the illness get worse, being unable to work. I mean, this was very frequent also, and I didn't really address that, and that kind of also causing mental anxiety. So, I mean, this was a very large problem in these periods of high unemployment. The doctors who wrote the essays for the British Medical Journal certainly felt somewhat helpless to deal with the ways that the health problems of their unemployed patients progressed. Of course, there were also the men who were cured by getting back to work. I mean, that work is really the thing that was the core part of their identities that helped them, right? I mean, this was the central part of what made them tick. In both cases, however, unemployment was experienced as an embodied phenomenon that challenged men's identities and made them think about health and illness in new ways. Thank you. So I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. Yeah. Right. We won't get the red wig. Yeah. Less exciting.
Well, now you apparently need much more brains for employment than you did a few decades ago. Machines have replaced laborers in the current as compared to, what, 50 years ago. And the question I have is, are there more American men doing less manual labor compared to immigrants now?
So I can't answer that question. So my research is on Britain, and I don't know that question. I can't answer that question.
Would the same thing be happening in Great Britain now compared to decades ago?
Or there's just generally less manual labor.
the capacities of people to find work to which they are suited.
Right. I mean, they are, in both these periods, what you get are regional experiences of unemployment, right? And we have that now in the US. I mean, that is something that I can say, you know, where in the old manufacturing areas, there are still higher rates of unemployment than there are, you know, in areas that have developed the new technology areas. So the upper Midwest, you know, the old Rust Belt, I mean, those still have higher areas of unemployment. And that's the case in Britain, where they're, you know, the areas that had been old staple industries, the old steel areas, the coal mining areas, there's still higher unemployment there than there is in other parts of the country. So areas where there are skilled jobs, those are, you have less unemployment. So I don't know if that's answering your question. Partially.
So I wanted to ask about the possibility of government policy such as make work. In other words, in the 30s in the United States, there were a number of different programs like CCC that made work for people. However, it sounds like these kinds of individuals would be resistant to that kind of a program, as it would be made work not suitable for them. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, there were programs like that in Britain, public works types of things. In Britain, you have the history of the Poor Law, which was the public welfare system that existed really up through 1929. And this kind of tainted public welfare in many ways. And so anything that looked like the Poor Law was resisted. So the programs that were developed by the state, like any kind of public works program, had to not look like the type of work that was provided by the Poor Law. Like breaking stones and even making roads. It had to really look different because the Poor Law was considered, it was humiliating task work. So these men in the 1930s and 1920s and 1930s would have accepted state work because it's different. But the 30s, there were fewer programs like this. But the 1920s, there were some programs that were like making roads, laying out parks, things like that. It wasn't a job. No, it was part of public works. So it's not the same thing as taking a job. It's part of unemployment benefit. So it would have been different.
I'm interested in the use of the word medicalization. You mentioned that physicians, I assume folks involved in public health as well, would have started to see the health impacts of unemployment, which can either be framed as medicalization of a social problem or as sort of recognizing the health impacts of a social problem. And I'm wondering if you can tease that apart, or are those just two sides of the same coin? And
I think both things were going on. In that particular situation that I was looking at, it was very much medicalization, because they're saying, we are the experts. We are the ones who know how to deal with this problem. You know, we need to be consulted as you create this unemployment act. You know, that's why I think that was an instance of medicalization. It's seeing this particular case as, you know, we are the experts, right? So both things are going on. But they're saying we need medical experts to be looking at the problem of unemployment.
Having recognized the health impact of this social condition, you ought to bring health experts in to try and solve it. So the other piece of that question that I had, at least, is there is a sense in which there are only a few things that the public is willing to spend money on. One of them is healthcare. The other is security, police. And so as a consequence, the police and the healthcare system tend to end up taking on social problems that the welfare state, you know, won't cover, that the voters won't allocate money to. And so I feel like this happens both in police and in healthcare, that we feel kind of victimized by this, that we have to take on all of the social problems of the country. On the other hand,
hard to take you seriously.
Yeah, I know. Sorry. Well, anyways, I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that, and you know, is it okay for me in this context to be dressed as a woman? Because you also talked a lot about feminization of this problem,
right?
That unemployment leads to sort of feminization of these individuals.
Right. Well, and I'll start with that, right? Because this is a very particular group of men, right, that I'm looking at, who have a particular kind of macho culture, right? That historians,
Why?
Right, I know, yes. Because historians have looked at these men, you know, and kind of called them hard men. It's a particular type of manual laboring culture. So it's the lack of work is really, you know, takes away a core part of their identity. And so that the feminization there is really, and the way they talk to their doctor, what the doctors are saying is so interesting to me, about that they come and are looking for a purpose, you know, in their surgeries. But there's a big split between the 20s and 30s and the 70s and 80s, because Britain develops, they have the welfare state, right? So they have cradle to grave welfare, which we never have, you know. So they have national health insurance. So everybody's got health insurance, and that is really different from the 20s and 30s, the way health operates. I mean, really, the 20s and 30s, most of these people are probably going to be using poor law doctors, the really struggling people. And in the 70s and 80s, they're going to, you know, they're going to these same doctors that their middle class neighbors are going to be going to. So what was, I mean, I'm not sure I understood the question, like about how the police.
I'll skip that question and go to a different one, unless.
Yeah, actually, this is kind of following up on the feminization. I'm going to kind of flip it and talk about it as emasculation. And so I think this is probably less appropriate for the 20s and 30s, maybe later in the 20th century, because I'm fascinated by your fascination with how women and the relationship between men and women really unfold. And so my question as we think about the later part of the century is, women and children are additional burdens, or they're, you know, just this kind of mirror in which you're seeing failure to provide. But are women at any point in time, do they become competitors for jobs? Do women have to leave the home and actually further emasculate? So can you talk a little bit about that?
In both periods. In both periods. And it may even be, I mean, they're not doing the same jobs, really, in either period, especially these guys. I mean, not these, because they're the heavy jobs, but they're out working, and during the Depression, women had more work than men did, just because of the nature of the jobs. And so that, oh yeah, they talk about that, how horrible it is that their wives are still employed while they are not, and they're home and they're cooking, and you know, the women are working, and that, you know, that's just an added nightmare for them. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and you see that, I'm a lot research before this was in the 19th century, same thing. You know, anytime it's like the world turned upside down when the wives are working and they're not. You know, this is a big deal. You had a question, right? Did you have your hand up? No. Same. Yeah. Yeah.
So what is the, excuse me, what is the timeline as when unemployment happens and then the health starts to go down? And has that been looked at in terms of retirement as well? Is that the same kind of correlation between the two?
When unemployment happens and their health
Yeah, you're saying that when you're unemployed, it affects your mind and body, and you start to kind of have these detrimental effects.
Right.
So at what point in time do we see that happening? And then is that similarly seen in retirement?
That's really interesting. For these guys, I would say their health effects are going to be really fast, especially their mental health is going to be really fast. I mean, there's no study of the, you know, in terms of the sources that I have, there's no way to track that. You know, nobody's saying like a week after I became unemployed, I felt ill. So I don't have any sources that are going to be able to articulate that. But just my speculation would be for these men, their anxieties and their stress is going to happen almost immediately. The physical stuff could happen. I mean, they're not going to have nutritious food. The benefits are not good in the 30s and 40s especially. I mean, 20s and 30s especially. So they're very quickly going to have issues with nutrition and their families as well. So it's going to be fairly fast. Retirement, they get by the 70s and 80s in Britain, they have good retirement pensions. And the 20s and 30s, they have pensions. So they're taken care of.
Well, I guess the reason I was kind of going up with retirement is you said that the wives were upset that they were around a lot more, and that the men were talking about how, you know, less pain happened when they were at work or they were able to hear, but you know, so that psychosocial dynamic, I was just wondering how that came into effect later for the 70s and 80s with them. So I figured that would be.
In my last book, I looked at men who stopped working and kind of, I had a chapter on age and kind of the pressures of, you know, what the experience of retirement was like. And it did, there is anxiety about retirement because work is so much a part of their identity. But I don't have any specific like, oh, this happens right away. And you'd have kind of age issues, right? That the men who are retired are physically older. So they may have health issues already, especially manual workers. Manual workers, retirement age is 65. You know, they'll be lucky if they make it to 65. These guys.
So I was involved in a conference once in England back in the early 90s, maybe mid 90s. And the topic was welfare reform. And the issue was that with welfare reform, which had made it more difficult to get on the dole, they had seen an enormous spike in the number of people applying for disability
Yes.
program.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you can talk about the relationship between calling oneself disabled in order to achieve social benefits that got harder.
Yeah, so that's actually past my period. That's right. That's like happening. That happened like fairly recently. Yeah. Which is fascinating. I mean, there's all this concern with disability fraud. That's like fairly recently, right?
I want to say this was in 96 or 97.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it continued, but there's still a lot of concern with disability fraud. I mean, that you go on disability, and they're concerned that you're not really disabled, but that's the way to get benefit because it's harder, right, to get other kinds of benefits. Right. I hadn't thought about that, and it's a great question, right? So you're going to call yourself, next book, call yourself disabled. I wonder if there's any of it going on in the 80s, because that's actually when, I mean, my book's going to end in the 80s. I'm just starting this research, so it may be something that I find, because that's really when Thatcher is cutting back a lot of this stuff. So I wonder if that would start showing up. And that would be really interesting, because that's making the decision to call yourself disabled, even if you're not disabled. And what does that mean in terms of your self-identity, right? Your self-identification. Embodiment, right.
There was a book out of this conference. I'll loan it to you if you like. It's called Malingering and Illness Deception.
Yeah.
The whole conference was about detecting malingering and so on.
Well, there's some of that with unemployment. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate y'all coming.
Tess.
Any final words of gloating, Tess?
No, I would love to say, though, I actually think you make a pretty good redhead. I don't think that your choice of outfit is quite appropriate for work, appropriate for anything, actually. But I appreciate you. What a great, that you are that you did this so well.
I know, the t-shirt is good, right?